when 9/11 happened, that's when I wanted to be a bigger part of the team. And so I went and looked at ROTC. I had no idea what that even meant, but I just wanted to serve in some form or fashion. And so I understood I could get my commission as a lieutenant and lead people and be a part of this team to, again, go and take care of kind of what our enemies did to us, And so that's kind of continued to manifest itself because, as I say, and talk with other people, the military has actually been pretty good to me. The Air Force has been really good to me and my family, especially my fishing career, because it's moved us to all these different areas and bases where I could still pursue speckled trout. And that's actually really kind of the spark of Speckled Truth. I am Chris Bush from Speckled Truth, and this is the Tom Rowland Podcast.
That was Chris Bush from the Speckled Truth. The speckled trout is a fish that drives people crazy. It drives people to complete obsession, and it has done that with our guest today, Chris Bush. His life revolves around the speckled trout, and he has created, I guess you call it a blog, a website, a place, social media following called the Speckled Truth, and it's all about hunting giant trophy speckled trout. He's got a tremendous following. He's got a group or a goal, I guess, that he sets that you can become part of this group that catches a dirty 30, a 30-inch trout. And in doing that, he's collecting a lot of data that he hopes is going to protect these fish for the long run. Chris is a great person to talk to. I really, really enjoyed it. He's got a great story, and I hope you enjoy this podcast as much as I did with my friend, Chris Bush from the Speckled Truth. All right. I believe that I have Chris Bush from the Speckled Truth on the phone. Chris, man, it is really good to talk to you. I've been wanting to do this podcast for a long time.
Yes, sir. Thanks, Tom. I really appreciate the invite. I do. And I know, we've been trying to set this up for a while now. And again, just really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys.
Yeah. Well, when I first started this podcast, I would ask people, who they would like to hear me interview. And it must have been like one of the first couple of weeks of doing this that your name first came up. And then over the time, it has come up over and over again as far as somebody that people want to hear interviewed. And so looking into what you do, it's pretty cool. I mean, you've got like a little more than you've kind of started a movement almost. I mean, they say that it takes 1,000 people for a movement. I would think that you definitely have that, but you're doing something really cool. Tell me what the Speckled Truth is.
Sure. Yeah. So we are, well, first off, that's really cool to hear that. I guess we're somewhat in demand, right? Because that's a good thing to stay relevant. That's something,
right?
So I'm in the Air Force, and that's something that's perpetually preached throughout the Air Force, and your tenure in the Air Force is to always stay relevant. So that's obviously really good to hear. But really, the Speckled Truth is really our bread and butter, and it's really a conservation, not necessarily a movement. It's more so an ideology of just taking care of a resource, and it's a resource we truly, truly love, and it's really the resource of trophy speckled trout. Now, we love speckled trout in general, but trophy speckled trout are just something, for me at least, there's something just totally different about this animal and about this fish, and that really just draws so much out of you, not only as an angler, but as a person. And so throughout the course of kind of creating Speckled Truth, and I wouldn't even necessarily creating Speckled, just kind of throwing things out there, and our passion and love for the game, our main focus was really just kind of taking care of that resource. And our simple message, and I've talked about this almost ad nauseum to some extent, but it's really just a simple concept, and that's just take what you need and release the rest. And so we try to perpetuate that through the majority of our articles, through our social media, and we really want to focus on the experience that the angler has with the pursuit of this fish, because that's what we, at least through my pursuit of trying to just catch bigger and bigger fish, and especially trout, and just solely trout. That's really all I fish for is trout. Everything else is, and I'll talk about hopefully my pops in a little bit, but really everything else is really secondary. So really trout, but capturing the experience of targeting these fish, and then also through the Speckled Truth, we try to develop as an angler. So we do like, so we talk about techniques, and we talk about a lot of the kind of out of the box techniques that we use, as well as some of the things that we've kind of been using for years, maybe with a simple modification. And then lastly, it's just kind of growing as a sportsman. And that's just creating that platform for conservation. So that's really our mission and our vision statement, is really capturing the experience, again, developing as an angler, and then growing as a sportsman and creating conservation.
You're doing a good job. One of the things that stuck out to me right away was the quality of the writing. Like, it's
That's
not
all.
well, I mean, I can tell that you work really hard at it, because it's something, you have a different little spin to it,
Yes, sir.
because it's like, you can just go on some different websites, deer hunting websites, turkey hunting websites, different things where you're just getting tactics, and it's a
Hmm.
very how-to kind of centered thing. But what I really liked about what you're doing is you're writing stories. Like,
Yeah.
you're bringing the tactics and the techniques and the passion for the sport into these stories that you're writing, and you're a good writer. Where did that come from? How did you become a good writer? Were you a good writer before this, or is this kind of made you a good writer?
So the reason I'm chuckling so much and like I'm trying to maintain my composure here is because, hey, look, I'm from New Orleans. I'm from South Louisiana, and I always kind of self-identify myself as already having the really hard time of just creating and stringing together two sentences verbally, let alone writing it. Right. So as a
Mm-hmm.
product of the school system in New Orleans, I don't know if my English teachers would have said Chris Bush in high school was anywhere near a probably satisfactory writer, let alone a decent writer. So that's why I chuckle. But honestly, I guess maybe what it really took was just writing about something I just had a passion in it, and so I started reading more, and really, and it was his birthday yesterday, and I actually called to mind him through an Instagram post, and that's Captain Mike McBride. And so, if you're not familiar with Captain Mike McBride, he is one a legendary trophy speckled trout angler here in the South Texas landscape. But what he did though is he wrote, I think, for I don't want to undermine his longevity, but I would say maybe 20 years for Texas Saltwater Fishing Magazine. And if you haven't read any of his articles, you need to, because reading that, I model my writing style after his, because what he does is he teaches you even though you don't know, right? And that's I think the
Mm-hmm.
mark of a really good writer, because he's telling a story. You're so encapsulated in the actual story that once you're done, you're like, wow, that was one, I want more. And then secondly, like throughout the gist of that, you just learn maybe how to fish a corky, or how to fish a top water, maybe some various techniques or situations that you would throw a top water or whatever, or downsize. And so throughout the course of writing, and then not only that, throughout the course of knowing Mike McBride personally, he became my writing mentor. And so he always says, Chris, you're developing a good command of the English language. So I'll take that as a compliment too. But I always kind of run things by him and see, one, if it's meeting the mark. And because I don't want to get too, yeah, I'm like you, I've read a lot of articles and throughout the course of my time, and they can get, pretty repetitious, but, it's easy to write about something that you're so passionate about. And again, it goes back to creating and creating the experience, right? And capturing that experience for
Mm-hmm.
readers and writers and everything else. So yeah, that's really good to hear. Thanks, Tom.
Well, yeah, you're welcome. Well, I mean, you say it's really easy to write about something that you're really passionate about. I would say that it's really easy for some people to write about what they're passionate about, because there's countless hundreds of thousands of people out there that are interested in different things, and do a really poor job of communicating that to other people. And it comes down to like a style. Like you've got a style, and your writing mentor had a style. People like some of John Girac or somebody like that in fly fishing has a certain style that people really gravitate to. But I don't know that it's just easy. I don't know that it's just as easy as finding something that you're interested in. I'm kind of like you. I guarantee you that
my teachers are if somebody says, "Oh, I read this article by Tom Rowland," and they're like, "Well, certainly that's a different person than I knew
Yes.
growing up." Because I mean, I had one teacher, Mr. Chet LeSueur. He told me one day, I'll never forget it. He like right in the middle of class, he was like, "Here, let me read something to you guys," and he read a little piece out of my essay, and I was
Uh-huh.
like, God, that sounds like something I wrote. That's so weird. Why would he be doing that? And he's like,
Yeah.
this is good writing. This is good writing. This is Tom Rowland's writing. It's really good. And that was the first time that
Yeah.
anyone in school, I didn't do very well in school. School was tough for me. And that I remember that day so well because that was the first time that a teacher had said, like, this is really good and really encouraged me to do more. And that one day and that one time like gave me a lot of confidence
Confidence. Yeah, sure.
as a writer. And I think confidence as a writer or a communicator or like a fisherman or an
Fishing.
athlete
Yeah.
or
Yep.
something, all of that, when you finally get that one person, and they don't even, I mean, like, I can remember this, and it only happened, it was like a 10-second thing that had this massive impact across my whole life. And the next thing you know, I'm writing all kinds of stuff when I grow up. But I look back on that. I've even talked to the guy. I'm like, you're not going to remember this, but you gave me the confidence to keep
That's awesome.
writing. Do you have something like that? Like where you wrote something and you're kind of like trying to string together these words into a sentence, like you said, and then you get this feedback like, dude, that was really good.
Yeah, I actually have, and so the guys that actually helped me with Speckled Truth, and I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about them. Kyle Johnson, Edward Crum, and Keith Morrison, is along with my dad, but they obviously read and write and stuff like that, and so I kind of run some things through them and write, and they're like, hey, that was actually really good, and so not coupled with them, but then obviously Mike. Just his longevity in terms of an author, and in him having from an editorial process, et cetera, him going, "Hey, Chris, that was actually really good." That's all that. That is like the only thing I needed to hear, because is it probably in line with a lot of the literature that's out there with proper writing styles and formatting, except probably not. No, but again, right from the heart, and hopefully that emotion kind of comes through the word. But yeah, I would probably say Mike would be that. And I've never had a teacher probably, or I've never had a teacher say that, especially with regards to my writing style. And they would be shocked, I think, if that came through. Hey, Chris is a pretty good writer.
Yeah,
Like, I'm sorry, who's that? Thank God I could
May
actually. I
I
think,
mean maybe, but maybe somebody's just some of the teachers are just kind of like, well, I guess he kind of found his thing eventually,
yeah, maybe so. Yes, sir.
Um, that's cool. Well, your passion and your emotion does come through in your writing. I read the latest entry this morning on your blog, and it was about it's really about your dad fishing with
Yes,
you,
sir.
and it was really evident, the relationship that you have with him and what he's
Yes,
meant to
sir.
you. And then you go into this other part about your dad, which I'd like to talk about here, which is this how much fishing he's done
Hmm.
and this tagging program.
Yes,
Like,
sir.
how did that all get started? Well, first of all, did you did you and your dad fish for trout growing up? Like, was that how you got into all this, or was that kind of a later thing for him?
So my dad, he grew up in a different era, right, in terms of fishing. But fishing's always been at the forefront of our family, like core values, if you will. And so my dad always says, God, family, and fishing. Those are the three things you live by. And so prioritize your life as a result of that. And so he, fished a lot with my grandfather, who my grandfather passed away pretty young in my life. And I have an older brother. He's 10 years older than me, Kerry. And so my dad, he had a camp in Cocodrie in South Louisiana, in Cocodrie, and so it was called Pawpaw's Palace, and he grew up right there, fishing a Cocodrie area, and so he had a camp there. My brother would go, my sister would go. There's like family pictures of them down at the camp, and so 10 years later, and my dad was a huge duck hunter, outdoorsman, just a big Louisiana sportsman, and so my brother and my sister kind of grew up in that environment. they started to get older, and my dad ended up actually, I think that he sold the camp and then he built another one in kind of the Hope. Yeah, it was the. I'm trying to think now if it was the Lafitte or Port Sulphur area, and
Mm-hmm.
it actually ended up burning down, and so he was kind of like, okay, that's it. And so he bought 30 acres of land in the Kill, Mississippi. And this is around 1981, and that's when I was born. And so I was definitely a surprise to the family. And at that point, yeah, right, kind of fishing was put on hold. He just went from working at the post office to he had just started him and I call him my uncle, started their own automotive repair shop. And so my brother and my sister kind of grew up in that environment. But when we got the farm pond and I became old enough, what I ended up doing was literally catching brim, sun up to sundown, 3, 4 years old, just watching a red and white cork go down in bread balls. And I could not get enough. And so finally my mom
Mm-hmm.
said, Charlie, you need to go buy a boat and you need to give Chris the same opportunity Carrie had growing up. And so we did. And so we bought a little 15-foot weld craft called Get the Net, right? In the proper lexicon of South Louisiana, Get the Net. And so we started kind of fishing all over again. But I mean, he had obviously been really well established in terms of where to go and et cetera, et cetera. And so he kind of picked it back up. And then it was my fuel that I think kind of started fueling him more and more. And so we started going maybe once a month to like, okay, maybe 2 weekends a month. And then before long, if I wasn't playing baseball, we were on the water. We would launch the boat in Port Sulphur. We'd fish that morning over there, catching trout and reds, and then we'd catch the ferry in West Point Lahash, and then go launch in Point Lahash, and then go catch bass over in Delacroix in the Shrimp Lagoon area that evening, right? And so I just physically couldn't get enough, and nor could he. And so now it's just kind of manifesting. He's always lived underneath that same mantra of just catching trout, like that is the premier species in this family. And so that's what we did. And so as we've kind of continued to grow, and as this angling family, we just kind of kept, I guess, urging each other. And so that's kind of how it's. And then he eventually bought another camp with my uncle and two other guys on Martin's Canal in Port Sulphur, Louisiana, and that was it for me. I mean, high school, if I wasn't in school, if I wasn't taking class at LSU, I was down at the camp in Port Sulphur, learning the area, just couldn't get enough. And so that's just kind of how it kept manifesting itself. And so, yeah, go ahead, Tom. I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to ask, like, that seems like a natural progression into being a guide, like that's the direction that you would have gone, but you went slightly different way, like you went to the military. Like, how did that happen?
Yes, sir. So I'll never forget it. It was, yeah, obviously 9/11, and LSU was playing Auburn that week. I always say it. And so I walked in my apartment complex, and I'd always I actually played JUCO college baseball right there in New Orleans. So I'd always played baseball and been a part of a team, right? And so when 9/11 happened, that's when I wanted to be a bigger part of the team. And so I went and looked at ROTC. I had no idea what that even meant, but I just wanted to serve in some form or fashion. And so I understood I could get my commission as a lieutenant and lead people and be a part of this team to, again, go and take care of kind of what our enemies did to us. And so that's kind of continued to manifest itself because, as I say, talk with other people, the military has actually been pretty good to me. The Air Force has been really good to me and my family, especially my fishing career, because it's moved us to all these different areas and bases where I could still pursue speckled trout. And that's actually really kind of the spark of speckled truth, because throughout fishing various estuaries from South Carolina, literally Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, I've learned a tremendous amount, not only about certain estuaries and tidal flow, et cetera, but about technique and about, reading different waters and how the the fisheries here in the estuaries here in Texas have no tide versus the Georgia estuary, which has a tremendous amount of tide. And so, what are
Mm.
some different techniques to overcome these, and having and growing kind of that experience across the board is huge. And so, at the time, I was really still just trying to catch numbers of trout. And then when I finally moved in 2009, I'm trying to think about it, in 2009 to Keesler, back kind of towards home waters, which is in Biloxi, that's when I was like, you know what? I'm really going to start like trying to target just big fish and big fish alone.
Yeah, I want to talk about that, but I also want to like we started down this road of why your dad was doing this tagging program,
Oh, I'm sorry.
and
Yeah, yeah.
then, but I definitely want to get back to that in just a second. But tell me about, so your dad was an auto mechanic, and then and
Hmm.
then he got into this tagging program. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, sir. And this is awesome. And so he retired, I can't remember now, but I think it's like maybe 15 years ago. And again, he grew up in a different area where like ice chests full of trout were,
Mm-hmm.
if that's how you measured success. And so
Right.
as he's continued to grow, he's seen our estuary, our South Louisiana estuary, get ravaged by erosion. Now some land access issues and everything else. And so we obviously have super liberal limits. And that was my playground, and that was my brother's playground. And there's such an emotional connection with us in the Louisiana marsh and that fish and that fishery, to then see it kind of almost just kind of seemingly it's on the path of irrelevance and kind of going away. And so in 2014 or 13, that's when he was like, Tag Louisiana, which is the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, had a Tag Louisiana program where you could actually just shoot dart tags into the back of speckled trout and really redfish or whatever. But he tried to just do speckled trout, and they actually had an awards banquet at the end of the year for the top tagger for speckled trout, redfish, whatever. And so he started doing it kind of casually, and then what he found was is he was a like, and that was his mission, was to like give back to the resource, on like give the biologists maybe some data for them to understand more about a fishery, to safeguard a fishery if the bait's there, if they're moving, whatever. And so it started from popping maybe 100 tags to all of a sudden, towards the end of the tenure of the actual program, he popped, I think, a little over 3,100 tags in 1 year. I mean,
Wow.
you, and you talk about, he's a tremendous fisherman, and this is all on artificial baits. I mean, the guy can work a jig like nobody's business, but that gave him motive. That gave him a mission to go out there and hobble in and out of his yellowfin wife's, 17, his little skiff, and pop in and out of there, and then go and spend 105 days in the water, 110 days in the water. Because I mean, he can kind of cherry pick his days as a retiree, but what he's doing is he's feeling that emotional connection to give back to a resource that's given so much, not only to him but to his entire family. And that, I mean, that is an amazing mission.
Well, let me ask you this: like, he obviously had to have something, some kind of feedback that he was getting when he started this program. He did 100 tags, and then he's like, oh, "Okay, well, now I'm going to do some more." What was it that he was? I mean, was he like recovering tags, or was he
Yes,
learning
sir.
so much more about the fishing? Like, what was it that was getting him so much more excited about tagging?
Yeah, so one, he was getting recaptures, right? So he had about a 4% total. He had about a 4% return on or recapture rate on the tags that he popped. So over the course, I think of
On
like
his
four
own tags?
on his own tags. So he popped
Wow, he was
12,000.
recovering 4% of his own tags. He's
No,
catching again.
not him, other anglers.
Oh, okay. All right. All right.
Yeah. Yeah, well, here's I'll talk about that here in a sec, but like, yeah, so 4% of the recapture rate of his 12,000 tags that he's popped. Now he's starting to see maybe some correlation of maybe some, migratory patterns. But, and I'll talk about this now, is like he's actually recaptured two of his own fish that he's tagged in the same spot plus 30 days. So he was fishing a spot, he was tagging a bunch of fish, and then he released those fish to come back a month later and then catch that same fish that he tagged a month later. And so he's able to see that in one, it grew an inch. So that tells you that
Wow.
in that particular fishery, in that particular spot and area, man, there's probably a tremendous amount of bait because those fish ain't moving. And then not only that, if they're growing an inch in kind of a month time frame, there's that's a sign of a healthy estuary. So he's starting to kind of piece that together. But then not only that, Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, my dad's an older guy. He's actually a really well spoken guy, and he loves teaching people. Absolutely loves it, especially about speckled trout. And so he started going out to do like local talks at high school fishing clubs. Then he started going to like 4-H clubs and then talking to people about the tagging programs and removing odorless and aging fish. And then now what he's then starting to see is not only is his impact just tagging fish, but now it's socializing an effort in terms of like conservation, right? And taking care of it and
Right.
understanding more about it. And so, man, when your father, who's grown up in an era that is catch keep, if it came out of the gunnels, it's going in the ice chest, to now taking what you need and releasing the rest, and then making sure we have a resource that is so valuable emotionally to all of us. We got to safeguard that. And so that's
So
inspiring for me.
yeah, that's really cool. And I knew there had to be some sort of feedback he was getting to go
Yes,
from
sir.
just kind of casually putting the 100 in there to going crazy and putting
Yeah.
3100 in. I mean, because that tells me that he's learning. Like
Oh, yeah.
every time he puts one in, he's getting more excited, and maybe we could get to 4000 next year, and imagine how good that would be. It's kind of like, it's almost like we were talking the other day. I was talking with one of my friends, and we were talking about social media, and we were talking about feedback and just different things that you get. And he said, if Instagram and Facebook didn't have likes or shares or any sort of metric, of how many people were following you or how many people were
Yeah.
watching, it just would have gone away. Like it would have
Right.
been a nice idea and all of that stuff. But that's really the value of feedback. I mean, we've talked about that twice in this little conversation, the feedback from a teacher that can give you confidence to unleash this inner artist of some sort, whether that's a
Yeah.
writer or actual art or a photographer or something. Just somebody saying, man, that's really good. Or in the case of your dad, like, here's some information on the work that you've done, and he looks at it and is like, wow, I want to do so much more.
Yeah.
And I just think that's really cool. Like that's really something. And then the other information that I was interested to see if he was getting back was, like, now that he's like the super tagger and he's got the confidence of the Fish and Game and everything, are they starting to share, some of this data with him? Like, okay, well, these fish that you tagged over here were recaught over here. And that's when you're saying he's kind of piecing all this back together. Is that kind of what's happening too? That the more he does, the more information he's getting, and the more he's kind of piecing it all together.
Just for him, though, and that's the unfortunate reality, is Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, the commissioner of Department of Wildlife and Fisheries discontinued the program, and CCA Louisiana picked it back up, but at a much, much not as extensive as it once was, right? And so
Well,
he
your
he
dad broke them. I mean, they weren't expecting 12,000 tags, and so he crushed he crushed the bank account.
But
I,
well, yeah, no, and that could be the case, not him, but I mean, I know like Dr. Tedesco was a gentleman that he fished with. Between the two of those guys, I mean, you're talking close to 6,000 tags, but again, it goes back to, if Department of Wildlife and Fisheries instituted this program to understand more about a fishery, I'm still a little, and I'm not trying to call them out or anything like that. I'm interested to see what they actually did with the actual information as well, because I'd be really interested, because the information that he's getting is only coming from the tags that he popped, right? And so of the 12,000, let's again a 4% return. I'm not even going to try to do that math, especially from South Louisiana. So, but okay, you got those amount of tags, and so he's got those data points. But my God, I mean, if you had 6,000 tags in a year, and then you piecemeal that 4%, that's a much larger data set. And now you're able to see maybe much more correlation, but are biologists using it? I'm sure they are, and I'd like to see that information, or at least I'd like to see that they're using that information from a management perspective to make sure that, yeah, we're just properly taking care of that resource. So
yeah, that's interesting. So a new commissioner just kind of came in, and just that's one of the programs that just got discontinued right away as soon as he came in, or
it was.
did it take a little while?
Nope, he came in and pretty kiboshed it, and then ultimately he was removed, right? And so,
Huh.
yes, sir. Charlie Melanson is his name. I'm going to call him out, but yes, sir. He was immediately removed not too long ago, because, and this is the crazy paradigm, because you're in such a huge. I mean, trout fishing in South Louisiana is such a huge thing, right? Not only that, but
Yeah.
the limits are 25 per person per day. But then you're starting to get more and more people involved. I mean, you're talking about an armada of volunteers who are typically catch keep. Now an armada of volunteers catching, tagging, and releasing fish back into to take care of the resource. And then all of a sudden you just cut that. I mean, you talk about a blow, I think, for a lot of the anglers that were really super stoked about participating in the program. So, like my dad, you had some folks who were doing like 20 to 25 tags a year to like, you know what? I'm going to try to give him a run for his money, you know? And so you had, you know, dudes popping, you know, 900 to 1200 tags. And so, but now when they did away with it, it's like, what's the point now? You know? And so that's hopefully where we can fill the void. And I'm not the steer us there by any stretch, but take what you need and release the rest. It shouldn't matter the tagging program. It's a mindset of just whether that's exists or not. It's still about what do you really need, and then if you don't need it, then make sure that you release it to take care of it.
Right. Trout are a funny fish like that because I would imagine that's one of the reasons why I'm so impressed with what you guys have been doing, because a trout is a fish that, you know, you could have people over that have traditionally not liked fish, and you serve up a bunch of fried trout. There's
Yeah,
not going to be any leftovers.
true.
It's one of the best. I mean, literally, it's one of the best tasting fish that anyone. It's not fishy at all. If you say you don't like fish, you've probably never had fresh fried trout. And so it's a people get that fever like, okay, well, I'm going to take home a whole cooler and there won't be any leftovers, and when I bring home this other kind of fish, my wife doesn't like it, or it's harder to cook, or all of these different things. But boy, you fry up some trout and everybody likes those.
Yes, sir.
So to kind of combat that a little bit, I really like the idea of take what you need. Like, you're still endorsing, hey man, these things are delicious. Like,
Yeah.
let's definitely eat some of them, but we don't have to keep 25 per person for a 5-person trip. Like, there's no way we're eating all of those tonight, no matter
Yeah.
how what kind of party we have. But I still like the idea of endorsing eating them. And that's one of the reasons why so many people like to fish for them.
Yes, sir.
But then you have other people like yourself that go deeper into this. Like, it seems like what we started talking about before was the difference between just going trout fishing and going fishing for a 30-inch fish. Now, what is the tell me about the difference? Like, I mean, I like catching trout, and I'm a decent trout fisherman. It is not my number one species. So, but on other fish, whether it's a largemouth bass or a freshwater trout or tarpon or permit, there are certain fish that it's almost like a different sport. Like fishing for a 10-pound plus largemouth bass, you might catch one on some little lure that you're catching a whole bunch of little 2-pounders on, but it's unlikely. You need to actually fish for that fish. Same thing with giant freshwater trout. Like, you might catch one on a mayfly, you know, a size 16 dry
Sure.
fly, but typically you're going to need to throw some big streamers. You're going to need to fish at different times of the day. You're going to need to really target that fish in different type of water, like deeper, slower water maybe, or just places that a really big fish are going to hang out. And when you first get into the sport, that's just completely over your head. You're just hoping you catch one, right? And then you're hoping you catch a whole bunch, and then you're thinking, well, I just hope I catch one a little bit bigger than my friend. But then there's this day where you're like, no, I don't even want to fish for the little guys anymore. I only want to go for this, and if I only catch that one, that's fine, right? So tell me about that with speckled trout.
First off, amen to all that, because that is it, right? I mean, trout fishing in general is, I wouldn't necessarily say pretty easy. Trout is a species like anything else, unlike redfish, I would say, and that's kind of the cousin, right? But redfish to some extent are pretty easy to catch, right? If you see them or if you're sight fishing, you can pretty much pitch to them, they're going to eat. Trout are fickle, right? And they have a lot of variables that go into finding, you know, the fish. And so let's talk school trout, right? And so if you're going fishing for, let's say, a limit or something to take home, it might take, it has more of a cerebral component. You have to understand tide, kind of how that water's breaking, some bottom contour, and then presentation. And then once you figure that out, and then you find the fish, you can really catch the heck out of them, as you know. And
Mm-hmm.
so, but then you dial it up a notch. So, like you're talking about the 10-pound bass and all these other elite species, trout are the same way. And so you talk about the cerebral component, understanding the entire environmental conditions from moon to selenar to wind to time of year to, and then not only that, then presentation, then lure color, then, you have to really piece all those things together to really catch those big fish. And you say, well, why put yourself through that? Because there's so much more to learn, or there's a lot to learn, right? But until you hold, let's say, a 27-inch plus trout, let alone a 30, when you just hold one of those fish, and then you like, and I always say, and then you release it, like, you'll go, let's do it again. And so case in point is actually earlier in the fall, I took a friend of mine here in Texas, Dario Villanueva, and so he had always been a redfish guy. And he's like, man, he'd been following us for a long time. He's like, man, I'm really interested in like upping my trout game, this, that, and the other thing. So I moved back to Texas, and so we linked up. And so at this point, his biggest trout was 25 inches because he never truly fished for him. He'd been doing a lot of research, study, this, that, and the other thing. And so we finally go fishing, and he had been working hard at trying to catch one of these big fish. And we finally ended up a day to go fishing together. And he ended up catching one. It was like 28 and a quarter. I remember him hooting and hollering because we were kind of wading this flat, and he was pretty far away from me. And he's like, Chris, he's like yelling. And I'm like, what's up? Like, what's going on? And so he still got it on a boga grip, and he's like, wave me over. He's like a little kid, and I'm like, what's up, man? And so, like, you got one? He's like, yeah. And you could just understand he's like so excited. And so I get over there, and you could see, man, like he is shaking, right? Voice is shaking, smile ear to ear. He's like, taking this picture. You can see the smile and everything else. And then the marvel, right, at holding a 28-inch trout and like seeing the emotion and then ultimately releasing. And he's like, where I have five, and I give him a hug, brother, you did it. You got your citation, this, that, and the other thing. And so, and then he's like, I caught a 28-inch trout. Like that's just up my PB by 3 inches. But the next words out of his mouth is he goes, I want to do it again, right?
Yeah.
And so even though he didn't keep it, even though he put a ton of effort, a ton of time, and learned all these different facets about trout fishing and fishing in general, to finally reach that capstone of holding that fish and then feeling like the adrenaline and the jovial, component to that, to releasing that fish and watching it go away to hopefully get caught again, that is like, you cannot, there is not a drug in this world that is more powerful than that, And so that, when you talk about, dink trout and everything else, to the big monsters, that is like, that's why you put the time, energy, and effort. But it goes back to understanding so many variables and being a student of the game, of just putting yourself in situations, shifting your mindset of like, okay, if I don't get a bite all day, I'm okay because I'm gonna know I'm in the right area. I got the confidence of what I'm fishing. And if it may or may not happen, and when it does, it's like, oh my gosh. But that's the
Mm-hmm.
effort that big trout require.
Yeah, and I guess you're also very similar to some of the other things that we talked about. The fishing might be available to go catch 100, 12-inchers, but you're choosing not to do that, to
Yes,
go
sir.
in search of one of these big ones. So, like, what does that look like for you? Like when you have the schools happening and you've got a certain area,
Yep.
are the big ones going to be nearby, or are they going, but they're not doing the same thing as the schools? And I know that that's a very broad question. It would depend on so many different conditions, but it's like that so often, like with the other fish, is like there's going to be a ton of little ones over there, and all you're going to catch are a bunch of rat reds. Or if you go out here, all you're going to catch are the big giant bull reds. And if you're in a tournament, you're looking for this 27 incher, and they're going to be kind of doing a certain thing. They're going to be in a certain area, and you start to work this pattern out to where you get to those. I know what that looks like with the redfish, but I don't really know what that looks like with the trout.
In so the landscape's actually pretty similar because I've done it now across multiple estuaries. Florida, more. I'm thinking like as you're talking, I'm thinking about like the different estuaries. So over in Florida, definitely have done it. Over in the Banana River recently, when I moved, when I fished in Mississippi, I would often catch 15 to 17 inch fish, and all of a sudden catch a 27. So down here, actually, this past winter was a great case in point. One of the biggest ones I caught all winter was about a 28 and a half, and yeah, I mean, like two casts before that on a top water, it was like a 12, 13 inch fish. And all of a sudden, so it depends on time of year, I think. And I, I am definitely not, hey, this is how it's going to be. Man, there are so many variables day to day that there are no absolutes in fishing whatsoever. But sometimes in winter, bait's scarce, et cetera, et cetera. Hey, those little bitty trout are on the food chain, right? And so, I mean,
Right.
they're
Yeah.
equally as susceptible to getting eaten by a 27 inch plus fish, vice let alone a 30. And so a 12 inch ain't safe. My biggest fish was 11 pounds, 30 and a half, and it had a 15 inch trout in its gut. So
Wow.
they will definitely eat. But to go kind of back, my dad and I were fishing in Louisiana, and this was last year. And so I go back and obviously visit my folks, and so we typically make a trip or two, and we're fishing a spot we normally fish in a certain time of year in the fall. And man, there are like I actually wrote a blog post about it, and you could see there's a bunch of like boats fishing these grass beds kind of in this middle bay system. And then, I mean, we could have gone out there and caught 50 trout lickety split, but they'd be 12 to, let's say 15 inches. And so I told Pops, I said, hey, man, the grass was on the shorelines was actually pretty matted to some extent, but it would kind of give way to some sparse grass. And we were waiting for that water to come up. And I said, hey man, when that tide comes up, let's go start focusing on the shorelines and see if we can catch some of those bigger fish. And so we threw non-conventional, we threw the slick lure, we threw some weedless jerk baits, we threw actually corkies in 17 MRs when the water got really up above that grass. And what we found is those bigger fish, and we're talking, in South Louisiana, we're talking, let's say 18 to 22 inch fish to 23 inch fish. Actually, the biggest one we caught was like 24 and a half. It was like 5 pounds. And we were on the shorelines away from the crowds, and we were fishing kind of this grass that was flooded. And what we found is the bait was in the middle, but those bigger mullet had come up on the bank and kind of navigating through these kind of thicker grass beds. And so those big fish, although not as abundant, were definitely there, but you had to fish for them. And so, yeah, we could have gone out and caught 50 trout in probably an hour and a half or 2 hours. But, we fished till about 1, 2 o'clock and ended up with maybe like, I think at the best day we had like 22, but,
Mm.
18 to 5 pounds. And that's the difference in terms of mindset. So there's big fish there. There's big fish around. You just sometimes have to kind of get away from the crowds, think a little bit more outside the box, read your conditions, and then apply technique. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. We had to move around a
Hmm.
little bit to finally figure out kind of what those fish are doing. But we had the confidence to explore. We had the confidence in our technique and ability. And then so it's a matter of that point of just really covering ground and starting to kind of piece together a little bit of a pattern. And
Yeah.
I think that
Yeah.
rings true across various estuaries, in my opinion. But so
Yeah. That's pretty cool. So much of all so many different types of fishing is really confidence and just knowing, we're going to go over here and fish against this grass, and everybody else is over there, but if we go over there, we're going to do almost exactly what they do.
status quo, yes,
If you're
sir.
fishing in the fleet, you're going to catch what everybody catches. And so many tournaments are won like that. Like one boat takes off and runs 100 miles and gets in some other type of fishery that, an 18-inch fish isn't a giant one there. A 25-inch fish is a big one. And so they catch a 22 or a 23 and bring it back, and everybody else is catching 18s. And next thing you know, you're the winner. But it boils down to confidence of knowing, okay, well, this is something that we're going to do, and we're going to stick to it like all day. And if we don't catch them, we don't catch them.
And that's the mental grind, right? That's the mental toughness component about trophy speckled trout fishing, or big, let's say big speckled trout fishing, especially those trophies, is really having the mental toughness to go through that process, right? I mean, it is hard. You always hear people talk about, I'm fishing for 1 or 2 bites a day. That's a true statement. I mean, there have been days where I haven't gotten a bite, but to only go back to that same area, just it kind of in those day succession, and instill and it produce a 28-inch fish. So those fish are there. It's just a matter of the, major or minor coming up, or that moon phase hitting right or something. And that fish just perfectly presented, but you got to have the mental toughness to grind through it. And that's the hard
Yeah.
part.
So you've mentioned the lunar tables many times. What kind of correlation have you found with the lunar tables, and and like tide and stuff like that? Because I got to say, as a guide that was working every single day, I mean, there were many years where I was working, over 300 days a year, and I'm sure the lunar tables meant something, but
Yeah.
I was going anyway. It didn't matter. So like I just never put much correlation to that, just because I didn't have time. I'm just trying to get every second of sleep I can, right?
Yeah.
Like there's no time to
Oh,
to
yeah.
be doing that. But I am interested always in people, because I would have these people that would call up and they would be, I want to fish this day because this is when the lunar tables. I'm like, well, I don't know what that's going to be like, but if the wind's blowing 30, I got to think that that's a worse condition than the lunar tables are going to be able to outweigh. But I mean, what kind of correlation have you gotten with the tables?
Yeah, certainly. So, wow, that's a really dynamic question, but actually, there's answers I feel to really kind of all those, right? And so, I'll first address, hey, as a guide fishing 300 days a year, I'm not that guy, right? And so, as a guy who fishes now 5 days a month because of where I live in San Antonio and my proximity to the coast versus what I used to do 5 days a week, obviously plays a part to that, because you're going to go regardless, right? You have clients, you're trying to put people on fish, and so now the thing is, though, is understanding at least those majors and minors, and if the environmental conditions, wind, and everything else kind of aligns, putting yourself in those A spots, if you will, during those prime
Mm,
times is probably pretty good,
mm-hmm.
right? And so at least having an understanding of going. Now, for me, I don't go as much, and so now I look at a moon and a Lunar chart, because if I'm gonna go during these days, I'm gonna cherry pick the days that I feel have high productivity, because as a 3 hour drive to the coast for me, that's an
Mm-hmm.
investment in time, right? I get up at 1:30, I leave the house at 2:15 to drive down there and fish first light till like 1, and then I drive my butt back. And so on the very rare occasion, I can actually stay overnight because I have 3 kids and a wife, and so I'm just trying to be a good dad too. But so now I'm looking at really prime time of when I can actually go. And I feel like if I'm gonna go, at least the odds are in my favor. If and I can somewhat cherry pick my days, because I'm not gonna go when the wind's blowing 30 at the southeast and it's a really good day, like where you have to go, right? So,
Mm,
but going back to Sullinger and moon phase and how I think it relates to trout feeding behavior, this is what I've kind of seen over the course of our programs. And so we offer 2 programs: the Dirty 30 program, which is a study for kind of 30-inch plus trout, and then we offer a state trophy trout citation program, which is for 27-inch plus trout. And these are across states, from anybody who fishes for trout can register a fish, but it's really from Virginia to Texas. And so we've been compiling this data for 2 years. And so the correlation there is that we had some theories as anglers that big fish fed on new and full moons. Well, that's true, because statistically speaking, the majority of those fish that are registered in those programs on the date they were caught are typically associated with both of those moon phases. Even more so this year in Texas, let's say the state trophy trout citation program. So for 27-inch plus fish, to 30-inch fish, at this point, I think is like 56 or 50 or let's say 60 fish registered in the program. If you break it down by days in the month, so like the 1st through the 7th, the 8th through the 15th, and then so forth and so on, what you find is like there's a higher correlation pre-new moon, and then there's a lower correlation after the new moon, and then you'll see a spike again right before a full moon. So if you were looking at it, you'd say 9, 6, 6, or I'm sorry, 9, 6, 10, and then whatever, 7. I'm not going to do again the math, but that's what I'm saying. And so you're seeing these kind of ebbs and flows and these peaks and valleys associated with pre-new, pre-full, and then obviously on those days as well. And so those are theories that we're trying to kind of get at a little bit, which is like, hey, these big fish have feeding windows, and that's true, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's this misnomer that they feed once a month, and then they'll go eat a big mullet and they'll go away for a month. I actually would kind of somewhat disagree. I think when that feeding window is open, and they'll eat a lot, right? I mean, if I caught a fish that had, a 15-inch trout in its gut, and across social media, you've seen, various people, especially here in Texas, where they'll catch a fish on a big, head and super spook, and that,
Mm-hmm.
in that 27-inch fish, they got a mullet sticking out of his throat, and so those fish, man, when that white stripe goes, they're eating, and they're eating a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and so they'll
Mm-hmm.
eat, in mass, and then they'll kind of probably lay low for a while, and then when that window opens up again, they go right back to it, and so that's kind of the stuff that we're getting at. And so that's where I think moon phase and then Selinar is really just the dictation of those high productivity times during the day. So your majors and minors. So if you have, an early morning major or you have a mid morning major, you want, for me as an angler, I want to be in my most productive area that has big fish, and I want to be fishing at or around those times, because if there's a fish present, statistically speaking, through the data we're collecting, is that, yeah, they feed kind of in those windows. And I'm not saying it's 100%, I mean, those days rated 2, I've caught 100 trout, and obviously dinks, but on those days rated 8 or 9, I might not catch 100 trout. And I've also obviously really struggled on those really high rated days. But I feel like there's a correlation between Selinar activity and those days rated they're high to those big fish feeding windows. And that's kind of my
That's
thought
interesting.
thought process and all
Do
that.
you
Yeah.
do you think that that trout anglers, specifically trout anglers, that are looking for these true trophy fish, there's obviously, just like in any other fish, 90% of the big ones are caught by 10% of the anglers. It's probably even a smaller percentage of that with trout or something like that, like the truly giant fish. I've always kind of thought, like when you're telling me that the biggest fish you had a 15-inch trout in its belly, and I've heard that, and I've seen other things like somewhat kind of a small fish. You clean it, and it's got this giant
Yeah.
something in its belly.
Right.
And I'm thinking, it seems like if you really wanted to catch these big ones, that you'd use these big swim baits and other things that first of all, you're not catching any little ones. It's as
Hmm.
big as a little one.
Yeah.
And do you think that a lot of anglers are using stuff that's too small? I mean, obviously the big, elephants eat peanuts, and you can
Yes,
you
sir.
can catch big fish on little things, obviously. But if you're really after that big one, what are your thoughts on just like oversizing to where you're using like a 10, 12, 15-inch bait for these giant fish?
Well, so will it probably work? Maybe. For me, though, in terms, no, no, and here's my rationale behind that answer is because I'm not gonna lie, I don't fish the California Delta, so I've never thrown an 8 to 10 inch rainbow trout for giant largemouth bass. And so, if I don't develop the confidence to throw or know how to fish that, now I'm saying I could learn, but again, I just don't have the volume of time on the water I would love to
Mm-hmm.
have. Right now, if I could go every day and not have clients or anything like that and fish by myself and really pick it apart, oh yeah, I would start throwing a bunch of 8 to 10 inch line through swim baits, because I feel the value to produce, because I want to make sure that I'm going down there and one, obviously trying to be productive, but that is a technique. I don't think necessarily you have to understand in terms of like casting and reeling, but the mental fortitude in your brain to go, I'm going to chuck this 8 to 10 inch line through swim bait or this big Huddleston, and then just chuck and wind all day. And then sure, I'm sure those big fish eat. Typically speaking, though, let's dial it down. I would say, 4 to 6 inch swim baits or 4 to 6 inch jerk shads. I definitely feel like people, I don't want to generalize it that way, but we're comfortable fishing smaller baits, right? Because,
Mm-hmm.
we're comfortable getting bites. But if you're looking for those bigger fish, I've thrown like the new Texas Custom Lures Double DXL, right? Which is a huge, if you looked at it, you're like, this bait's designed for offshore. But I've caught, some really pretty fish that have had this thing wedged between their mouth. And so it just takes the confidence to kind of develop the confidence in fishing these bigger baits. But I've also, one of the baits, and I'm going to let the cat out the bag to some extent, but, one of the baits I've actually developed a tremendous amount of confidence in is actually called a Mega Bass Dark Sleeper. And it's just a little 3 inch, nothing to do swim bait, but
Hmm.
it's not necessarily just the actual swim bait itself. It's the capability the swim bait provides because has these really unique weed guards. And so I'm fishing structure that I want to fish really slow and methodical in this particular situation, right? And so I want to be able to pick it apart, with more finesse as opposed to just grinding through it with something that I'm really worried about getting trebles hung up on, et cetera, and blowing a spot out. So I use a lot of these different things that are very situation specific, very specific, for that particular bait and yeah, in lure and so in
Hmm.
technique. So, but generally speaking, bigger baits do catch bigger fish. I mean, that's the 6 inch gambler flapping shad or the K Wigglers ball tail shad or the willow tails. I mean, these are 5.5, 6 inch swim baits that really catch the heck out of fish. And it's
Mm-hmm.
good because if there are smaller fish, let's say 18 to 20 inch fish, they're still going to eat it. But you still have the
Right.
upside of if there's a 30 inch fish there, it still has that presence to then appeal to that fish as well. So there's kind of a happy medium. Yes, sir.
Yeah, that would be my experience with trout. Freshwater trout fishing when we would go out there like on a day off. It was so tempting because you knew these giant fish lived there, but you were you're guiding there every single day, and nobody these things are not coming up to a grasshopper or to a mayfly or anything like that. So but the state record was 28 pounds.
Good
So,
gosh.
and we're catching these fish that are, 18 inches.
Yeah.
And they're nice fish and everything, but throughout the course of the summer, you'd have something on, and one of these giant ones would come out from under a bank or something and flash it, and you're like, "Whoa!"
Oh my god.
Like
Yeah.
there's a real fish here. And you
Hmm.
come back on your day off, and you're thinking, it's one thing just to kind of throw a streamer in that little hole or whatever and see if you could get it out. But even the streamer then would be like 4 inches. And so I kind of got this idea like, if we really wanted to catch these things, we tie up like an 8 inch or a 10 inch, 12 inch fly and chuck that thing all day long. And, it's like we could probably catch, 20 or 30 going down this river, just fishing like we always do, or we could catch possibly nothing like this because the fly was so big that a little fish isn't going to eat it. They're not even going to flash at it. Like it's another little fish. And, most of the time we caught nothing, but occasionally we would get a good one. So I was just kind of wondering what that was like in that kind of trout fishing.
For me, one of the ways I get after it though is I kind of have a myriad of baits, and I have the confidence to fish various techniques in certain sizes, right? So I'm totally comfortable throwing much larger jerk baits towards the 5 inch realm, right? The lip jerk baits versus like just sticking with a small 3 inch soft plastic all day, right? And so what I try to then do is just okay, get a few bites. Okay, I know some fish are here. Now I can start focusing on some of those bigger fish, right? And some of those bigger bites that are maybe available, maybe not, right? But if there's a big one there, at least I'm going to give myself that opportunity to eat. And so that also goes back to, fishing, different, areas. So really, really skinny flats, shin deep or knee deep or less, right? And so targeting those areas that are, you're like, man, that's not a whole lot of water over the top of that thing, but
Mm,
you'd be surprised how big of a fish can get that skinny, and it takes a lot of ground to cover sometimes. But man, if you're gonna catch one there, it's gonna be a monster, right? And so you just kind of have to
yeah.
grind and cover and use different techniques to put yourself in the best situation available, but have the confidence to fish all those.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
interesting. All right, so I want to ask you this question. I'm gonna show you my ignorance of just the trout fishing culture, and especially as it goes from Florida moving west into Texas. So
Mhm.
this is let me paint this picture for you. This is what I saw moving from Florida. We got on the redfish tour, and we're happily fishing in the Florida Keys, and we catch plenty of redfish and trout down there. But as we move into different areas, people do things differently. And the first thing that we saw was that there would be certain parts of Florida where redfish was king, trout was just a bycatch that people just shook off
Very
and
true.
threw it there. Then as we moved a little further west, it turned into kind of both were highly prized. And then further west, the redfish was a nuisance and the trout was the king. And even further west, and then it's all about trout, like in the Texas area.
Yes, sir.
So that was kind of interesting to me. I also noticed that the same thing happened with a tackle. Florida, 99.9% of the people throw a spinning rod. As we moved into different areas, it was about half and half. You go further and further west, it becomes all bait caster. So I'm trying to figure out, like, okay, well, why is that? Because I know why I use a spinning rod and I know why I don't use a bait caster. So why is it that so many people in the Texas area are so adamant about it's a bait caster or nothing? Like, what do you think about that? Like, I mean, do you see that too?
Yeah.
Like,
So yeah, those are two really true assessments. And yeah, having lived in all those and fished all those, the answer is yes. Those are all true. I don't know. I'm not a Texan in terms of like understanding that mental capacity, but I was underneath. I've been taught. Obviously grew up fishing a spinning reel. Once I made the transition to a bait caster, there is different feel and there's different. You've kind of mastered the art of being able to kind of cast and work a bait differently and this, that, and the other thing. And so I always counter argue people that go, especially here in Texas, because I throw a spinning rod here actually a lot lately because I throw a lot of techniques that aren't traditional here in Texas. And so,
mm-hmm,
and they've been really productive. But, I kind of get made fun of, man, you throwing that old egg beater, this, that, and the other thing. And I'm like, okay,
mm-hmm,
do this for me. If you went up to Kevin Van Dam or Iconelli or, any of those guys, Swindle, and you said, hey, dude, you're not a very good angler because you throw a spinning rod. He would look at you and go, are you crazy? Like, these are tools in a toolbox, right? I mean, they give and they offer different things like anything else. And those elite series guys on the BASS or the MLF now, they are so in tune with tackle and the capabilities that gear provides in fishing certain techniques. That's why they're the best in the world in what they do, right? That's why they make a living off of fishing tournaments and this, that, and the other thing. So to say that it's kind of an elitist thing to throw a bait caster or, hey, I get more casting distance, throwing a spinning rod, that's why I'll never throw a caster, because I heard that argument too over in Florida, and so I've heard both of them and I've fished them both, but I think it really goes back to just understanding the techniques that you want to provide. So I actually weighed with two rods. I weighed with the bait cast and I weighed with the spinning rod. And I throw a lot of my jerk baits, lip jerk baits, as well as the double D's and the slow ascending, as well as the 17 MRs on a spinning rod because my fishability and the technique that I use has again, growing up fishing a jig and fishing with a bait cast and having that rod tip up and always being taught that the natural tendency is for me to have my rod tip up. Well, I want to get that bait down. And so now with the spinning rod and the way I hold it and the way I retrieve, I'm able to kind of keep that rod tip down and work that bait and still have the feel and connectivity and I know exactly where that bait's at and what it's doing. And so it gives me that tool to present that bait in a certain technique. And now on the flip, like if with a jig, I will not throw a jig on a spinning rod unless it's like a little bitty Ned rig or something like that, where I do need the
mm-hmm.
castability and the light line capability. But a jig, corkies, or heavier swim baits, I typically almost always throw on a bait cast rod because, again, my natural tendency is to keep that rod tip high. I want to have connectivity with my line and the bait. And I can make super long casts because that lure is generally just heavy. And so I'm able to, in terms of my twitch retrieve and my cadence, I'm just in tune with those. And so you got to have those, right? Those are tools the end result is really all that matters. Are you catching big fish or not? It's
Right.
irrelevant how you're doing it. And so,
Right. Well, that's kind of what I thought it was kind of funny. Like when I would see this is there were certainly, as we went over into Texas, there were certainly techniques and lures that they were throwing that were obviously better on a bait caster, right? I
oh
got
yeah,
it. Like, okay, fine. But then when you go into Louisiana and that kind of area, there were these techniques that you could do equally as well. I felt like you could do better with a spinning rod, like small jigs and smaller, lighter lures and stuff like that. I'm like, well, I mean, okay, that's great that you're more comfortable with a bait caster, but that doesn't mean that the other is bad or ineffective.
right.
And it only matters that you're able to do what you're able to do. But there was just this real. I mean, it's almost like a religion.
Oh
Like,
yeah,
this is the way it is, and we don't deviate from that. And then you'd go 100 miles in the other direction and it was exactly the opposite, and they're throwing the same lure, like and I was like, okay, that's cool.
yeah, and
Whatever.
yeah, you get made fun of. I mean, hey, flip your reel over. I'm like, dude, what are you talking about? I'm throwing a spinner rod. You know what I'm saying? Like, leave me alone. I'm catching fish. You do your thing. You know what I'm saying? And so it's such a different mentality. But my time in Florida, I actually threw a bait caster a lot. I caught a lot of fish on a corky over there. And it's funny
Sure.
on the east coast of Florida because those things were daggum always on clearance at Academy and Bass Pro. And I'd buy them pegs at a time, right? I'm like, I can't
Mm-hmm.
wait to move back to Texas because now I got a boatload of clearance, corkies. And so, but you come to Texas, oh no, those aren't on clearance, buddy. Those are
Right.
and so it goes back to I think just the general mentality. I did notice though in my time in Florida, it's such a clear water fishery, as and that's one of the things I probably didn't appreciate as much. And I'll give a tremendous amount of credit to the Florida anglers, and that's why you guys are so good at fishing because I was humbled. I mean, growing up in Louisiana, I mean, you could flip to a redfish, he wouldn't eat. He would hit the trolling motor head, and you'd flip to him again, he'd still eat,
Yes.
right? And
Yes.
so, but you go to Florida, as soon as you flip that bail and make a pitch to that fish, they're so line shy, they're gone. And so,
There are some areas for sure that that redfish are harder to catch than permit in the Florida Keys. I've seen it. They get a lot of pressure. They get the mullet boats. They get a lot of pressure up in these areas. And man, you can find those fish, and they can be extremely difficult to catch.
yes, sir. And so, seeing those big trout on those flats, right? And I was never able to successfully sight fish one. And I would dead stick the bait and I would kind of keep it there and trying to look at body posture of the fish. And then the patience, right? The tremendous amount of patience and understanding and being more in tune with kind of that fish and maybe where he's going to move. That was foreign to me, but I gained a better appreciation for that in Florida anglers, and that's why I know you guys are really good and dominate at a lot of the other fisheries because you're like, I mean, yeah, I'm sure if you go to Delacroix, you're like, this is ridiculous, you know,
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
easy.
Well, as far as the redfish goes, I
Yeah,
mean, it's quite a different program. Believe me, I like those fish better. I like big dumb fish. I
yeah,
mean, that they're my favorite.
sure,
The small smart ones are cute and fun to catch sometimes, but I'll
yeah,
take big dumb ones any day, any day. And if you combine the little muddy water in there, then
yeah.
they get
Oh my
even
God,
dumber.
right.
That's even better.
But then you go, okay, and then you take a Texas angler, right, where there's some clear water capabilities in a Baffin complex, in a lower Laguna Madre, and even in the upper Laguna. But like East Matagorda Bay, I've never fished Galveston, but like from East Matagorda Bay, hey, you got a tremendous amount of wind. You have a lot of turbidity in the water. And so now having the mental confidence to fish water that is really, really foreign to you and being able to be successful in that water clarity is different. So there's different mentalities and different aspects of their angling capability and IQ that if you fish both of them, you can pick up a lot on both of those concepts. And
Yeah,
then
no
now if you
question.
apply them, my God, you just become this really, really successful
That's
angling.
very true. And I think that's where, the tournaments taught us a lot about red fishing. As we'd go over, well, first time we went to Texas, I had no idea what to do. I mean, the water, you say water clarity. I mean, there
Or
was
lack of
no
them.
water
Yeah,
clarity.
yeah.
It was, I mean, if the water looked like that in the Florida Keys, every charter captain from Key West to Key Largo would cancel the trip. I mean, and these guys, that's just what they go in, and the wind's blowing 25, and
Hmm.
the water looks like, I mean, when I say it looks like chocolate milk,
It's an
dark chocolate
understatement. Yeah,
milk.
yeah, you're right.
And these guys are going out and catching plenty of fish. I mean, I was just amazed. And then, like you say, we kind of learned slowly how to fish over there, and then we can come back and use those same techniques to blind fish areas that we don't necessarily blind fish ever, and have great success in the Keys. And that was the biggest takeaway for the tournaments, is like, you learn how the Texas guys do it. You learn how the Louisiana guys do it, the Mississippi guys, the Alabama guys, the Florida Panhandle guys. Everybody's doing it a little bit differently, but a lot of those techniques will transfer over from one place to another. And if you go in it with an open mind, and keep your eyes open and mouth shut off, a lot of times you can pick up a lot of things
Yeah.
that can make you a lot better angler in your home water. Okay, so I have one more question, and this one may be the dumbest question of all. So this is the other picture I'm going to paint for you. We have a very expensive boat, and we trailer it all the way over to Texas. And we typically, in Florida, the only time we ever get out of the boat is when the bonefish are too shallow and we can't get the boat where we need to go, and so we get out and wade in ankle deep water over and catch a tailing bonefish, because the boat would not physically get there. So then we go to Texas, and basically in Louisiana it was kind of the same thing. Nobody ever
Hmm.
got out of the boat. And then we go over to Texas, and we would see this boat, and nobody would be in it, and it would be anchored up. And then we'd be running by going, that's weird. And then here's this little head sticking out of the
Yeah.
water with a fishing hat on it, way away from the boat.
Yes, sir.
And they're not in ankle deep water. They're in chest deep water,
Chest
like
deep. Yep.
right up to the top of their waders, or to their underarms.
Hmm.
And so all the Florida guys are like, man, did you see those people waiting? Like, what was going on there? Why would you take a perfectly good boat out to that area and then get out in armpit deep water and fish with your arms over your head? And there's got to be a good reason for it, because they're doing it all the time. So I just couldn't quite figure that out. And just like we're talking about, like, I wanna understand what they're doing, because maybe there's a way that I could apply it there. And I'm like, maybe it's there's these tiny depth differences in the bottom that they're trying to find. And the only way they can really find it is by all of a sudden their armpits get wet.
Yeah.
And now you're in the right depth. But I was like, man, one day I'm going to find somebody that knows about this, and I'm going to ask them this question, like,
Sure.
why? Why are
Why?
you getting out of your boat like that?
All right, so I'll get there. But the first part is, growing up in South Louisiana, we fished a lot out of the boat. But on the same token, is there was a time from May to September where we would fish the passes outside of Empire, Port Sulphur, and it was called surf fishing, but more or less it was wade fishing. We're on the fringes of the Gulf, we're fishing flats near these passes, and a trout would get in these troughs, right? And then obviously you'd be able to catch them, but we would do that wade fishing. So that was part of my DNA as well, in terms of fishing out of the boat and then wade fishing. So that the transition to fish over here was pretty seamless, as well as in Florida. Now, the reason I did it and the reason we did it there was because the tide was really hard coming through those passes. And this kind of gets to the answer, at least in my opinion. And so by wade fishing these passes in these troughs with let's say a foot and a half tide range, which is a lot of water coming kind of funneling through these passes with a lot of contour change, etc., it really just wasn't fishable out of a boat, because boat positioning, you couldn't keep it. It was very just it was too frantic. And so when you're fishing these areas by wade fishing, you are your power pole, right? You could cover ground, boom, all of a sudden you get a bite or you catch a fish, you stick the power pole, and that is your two legs. And so now you're able to present that cast again to that same area, and then kind of work it. And then all of a sudden you start finding there's just a bit more success. Or if that bite fizzles, you can lift that power pole and just wade 10 feet and all of a sudden get another bite and kind of just establish that pattern. And so the same, I
Mm-hmm.
think, rings true here in Texas. And that's what I've learned. And so I don't fish definitely armpit deep by any stretch. Typically waist deep or below, actually, really knee deep. Between knee and kind of thigh deep is really my money zone. I really like that. But I like covering at my own pace. I like fishing at my own pace. And as you know, that wind blows really hard here some days, really more often than not. And so fishing, 15 to 25-mile-an-hour winds can be pretty arduous when that boat position and that boat's just kind of cruising through these flats. So now by getting out of the boat, you're able to kind of establish your own wade pace. You're able to kind of get slightly upwind or maybe slightly crosswind and present that bait a certain way because you are your own kind of vessel. And that's why I really love it. And as a result, too, by covering that water and covering a flat, you're able to start picking up on just the slightest nuances of the bottom contour and body composition. And that is from like I like the crunchy mixture, as what I call it, where it's slight mud, but it has like this kind of crunch of shell. I love that. Or you might wade through some grass, or you might find yourself, hey, I went from knee to maybe just maybe 6 inches above that to kind of approaching, thigh deep, and then now I've come back up on another bar. So I know there's maybe a bigger pothole there, and so you're able to pick up on those slighter nuances. And now as you kind of establish a better understanding of a flat of an area, you can see, okay, that water's fall out, or now that water's come up with an east wind or a south or whatever it is, and now there's more water on that. Now I'm going to start focusing on these areas where, and there'll be small little patches of shell that'll go to mud or shell that'll go to sand, and so now that you know where those are, you're able to kind of pick those apart. So that's kind of a double-edged
Mm-hmm.
sword. It kind of dictates your kind of your wade pace, if you will, your fishing pace, and then not
Yeah.
only that, understanding it at a more complex level, the body composition and contour. And so that's why I think where you see a lot of guys, because yeah, it might, fishing with a lot of dudes here, especially Cat Mike McBride. He always thought, hey, there's a sexy little, drop right here or whatever it is. And, what does sexy mean, right? That might be 6 inches, but that might be all it needs for those big fish to just
Mm-hmm.
sit there and kind of pull those mullet up. And so that would be my best answer. And at least for me, it was pretty seamless, right? Coming from, fishing that environment during the summertime in a certain area to now fishing that all year round. And it makes sense to me. So hopefully that answers your question, Tom.
Well, no, everything that you just said makes sense, and it's kind of like what I had initially thought is maybe maybe they're just trying to feel the bottom, like especially in these areas where like we're so used to having clear water, we can just look down and be like, well, it's turtle grass here, it's sand here, it's a mix of turtle grass and sand. But when the water, you literally can't see into it for 5 inches, and it's 3 feet deep. How do you know what the bottom composition is? And especially if you're now in a bay boat and you're using a trolling motor, not a push pole. Because, like a lot of times when you're using a push pole, you can feel the bottom composition and you don't even, I mean, you could be blind out there and you would know, okay, this is shells and this is mud and this is now shells and mud. And oh, we just got a bite. So if we stay in the shells and mud kind of area, then maybe that's what it is. And maybe it was the shells and mud, or maybe it was a depth contour, or maybe it was something else. But you're getting some kind of cue from the natural environment. That's kind of what I thought was going on. But some of these people that I was seeing literally were up to their armpits. And I just couldn't imagine how there could be an advantage to that other than maybe the wind was blowing so hard that they're just
Sure.
pushing through the area so fast that even at a snail's pace on the trolling motor, they're going way too fast. And so maybe waiting. So that's kind of what I thought. But we're just all these Florida guys are trying to put it all together, just going like, man, the best part about fishing here is you could have a really crappy boat and you'd just be getting out of it all the time.
Yeah, that's right.
Like you
Yeah.
would you wouldn't need a great
And getting back to
we
weight. Yeah. Getting back to wade pace, though. I mean, if you think about how a lot of anglers fish here in Texas anglers, is they fish a lot of those slow sink, big kind of, the Corky Fat Boys, the 27s, or, a lot of these slow sink baits. So when that wind is cranking, it gives you that capability of not moving a whole lot in terms of your body, but you're able to kind of fish that bait down, and then kind of keep moving slowly with it as opposed to just blowing through it. Because,
Mm-hmm.
we've done that as well. Where you're putting a drift sock out, you got your trolling motor on spot lock, and you just keep moving. You're like, oh my God. Yeah. So I really enjoy it. Just because you're able to kind of be in that environment, be in the conditions. Shoot, I've been able to feel through your waders. Sometimes it's crazy as it sounds, but you can sometimes feel, water temperature change.
Oh,
You
sure you
can
can.
you can
Yeah.
get up from one spot and you like enter the water, let's say a mile and a half down on another flat, and you can all of a sudden feel that like physically through your waders it's colder, not because you're wet or you have leaky waders, but like it just there's a dampness to it or something. And so all of a sudden you maybe start seeing some more mullet there or whatever. Okay, these fish are associating maybe with that cooler temp, and obviously there's a reason that mullet's there or whatever. And so, but the more you're able to feel that, the more you're kind of in tune with that fishery. So that may be a
Yeah.
component to it as well.
No, that happens in our bone fishing. We'll fish, the first of the incoming tide, and sometimes there is a situation where the tide is still going out, but the level is going up, and that can be interesting, but it doesn't result in a temperature change. And all of a sudden, you'll be wading along, and when you feel that temperature change on your feet, I mean, it's going from bath water to like refreshing.
Refreshing, yeah.
It feels like, oh wow, that feels like fresh water coming in here, and there's the first fish, and there's the second fish, and the third, and now they're tailing like everywhere, and it was totally a wave of cooler water coming in, and they're following that. So I get that, but it's just kind of a funny question that I always had.
The armpit deep though, I have no no answer
They
for
were
that.
onto the armpit pattern.
Yeah.
They had it all worked out. I don't know. Maybe you know what? Anymore, I don't look at anyone and think, man, that guy doesn't know what he's doing. I look at somebody doing something weird, and I'm like,
Yeah. Why
I
are they doing
wonder
that? Yeah.
wonder if he's hiding. Like maybe he's not armpit deep. Maybe he's knee deep, but he's now sitting so that it looks like he doesn't know what he's doing. We used to be in places, and I'd hear a boat coming, and I wouldn't want anybody to know we were there, and we would throw up it's like sit on the cooler, eat a sandwich. Everybody sit down and pretend like you're eating a sandwich, and open the cooler lid and all that stuff. And people would just drive by thinking, oh, that looks like a good place for a picnic. And you would wait for them to go all the way out. Then it's like, okay, now
Let's
you
go.
can fight that fish again.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's crazy.
Anyway, man, you got so much good information. I'd love to do this again, but why don't you? We might have to cut this one here. Why don't you tell everybody how they can find more of your stuff and get involved with your group?
Yeah, sure. So we have thespeckledtruth.com is our website. And actually, we're looking to that we did the boat show, the Biloxi boat show this year. We're going to do a couple more boat shows in the upcoming years, particularly Biloxi again, and Louisiana Sportsman Show, and in the Houston Fishing Show next year. But the idea was to have a better website. We needed a more of a digital presence, but we still have it out there. It's thespeckledtruth.com because I went from literally writing this, little blog, this journey or this journal to now we have, and we want to create more content where we have more how-to videos or more kind of podcast type things, but we don't have the host right now or the digital presence to give us that. So, but thespeckledtruth.com is really our website. We also have social media on Facebook, just Speckled Truth on Facebook, and in Instagram. Those are our really two main social media platforms, and that's really where we push a lot of our content. Again, we just don't have the capability right now on our website, so the other things that we have out there are typically on our social media. So those are our three, Tom, and again, I really appreciate you having me today.
Oh
and
man, you got so much good, interesting information.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Tom. I really appreciate it. And so, yeah, participate. Last little plug, but for the Dirty 30 program, the Trophy Trout Citation programs, again, if anybody has any questions about that, please hit us up, message me, whatever, because that's really just capturing data. We don't care about sharing the information. If you don't want it shared on social media, we do not do that. We don't care. We just want the data more so we can understand the subset of species that we call it, these big trophy fish that we can get more data on to better understand, to maybe be, more kind of at the forefront in terms of conservation for that particular species and that particular size of species. So anyway, please participate if you can, or if you have those big fish, we'd love to have them submitted.
That's good, man. Well, I'm sure that you can not only find some people to participate in that program, but maybe you also find your next podcast host, somebody listening to this right now that could do the Speckled Truth podcast for you.
Thank you.
It'd be awesome. All right. Well, listen, man, thanks. We'll do this again. And until next week, we'll see you guys later.